Hello there, and welcome back to More Than a Lumpy Jumper. This week, we are having a tussle with imposter syndrome. What is it? Who has it? How it manifests? And strategies to deal with it. Come and join us as we explore both research and our own experience in being a fraud and doing it anyway. Hi there, Bridge.
Hey, Bobby.
So, how are we going to get into this one today?
Yeah, I have to say at the beginning that I do have a little bit of an issue with the concept of imposter syndrome. I think that it's used a lot. It's bandied around a lot. And I'm not sure that always it is what when we talk about imposter syndrome, or when people talk about imposter syndrome, I'm not sure that they always are, in fact, talking about imposter syndrome. So I might, maybe just to clarify it a little bit, this idea of the imposter phenomenon came up from a couple of psychologists, I think, Pauline Rose Clance and Suzanne Innes in 1978. And it effectively talked about this idea, particularly for women, about lacking self-confidence, not feeling like they belonged, feeling that they were a fraud. And so there's been lots and lots of work done on this about how we can, particularly for women. And that's one of the issues I have. There's this implicit blame on women, i.e. there's something inherently wrong with women's ability to be confident, etc., which for me is an excuse not to look at what role workplace systems play in fostering and exacerbating that feeling amongst women that they don't belong. Because for me, often that feeling of not belonging, feeling of maybe not being in the right place, isn't to do with the woman at all. It's not an imagination. It is because of the systems. So while I agree that there is a feeling of people can feel that they are not confident enough to be in a place or to be where they are, I do think that we need to be aware that sometimes what women are feeling is not imaginary. It's not something to do with them. It's something that is because of the systems in which they are. So that's why I kind of want to just flag that at the beginning.
I know that we've toyed with whether we wanted to do this episode or not, because not differing views on imposter syndrome, because I am in violent agreement with you. I think we just come at it from different places. But I too went back and checked on history. And I think this is interesting to add into the mix as well before we get into it. So I too came up with the two psychologists. That was back in 1978 when they first started talking about this. And they were talking about inadequacy, feelings of unworthiness, that things were much more luck than skill. And then there was hardly anything in terms of research. So it kept getting bandied around, but there wasn't that much research. So from 1991 to 2001, 10 years, there were only 215 studies. 2001 to 2011, another 10 years, 400 studies. And then 2011 to 2021, 3,500. And within that, the marvellous Amy Cuddy, in her TED Talk on power in 2012, got a huge, not exactly backlash, but a lot of communication afterwards, because she was suggesting that it didn't happen to men. And so she started taking a look from a research perspective around men as well. And the issue that she was finding was that men get conditioned much earlier to not be talking about vulnerability. So they mask it. And then I also found some other stuff as well. So the jury's still out on all of that, because as close back in as 2019, in terms of research documents, 16 found that there were gender differences by looking at imposter syndrome, and 17 said that there weren't. So I'd like to invite us to talk about it as if it happens to everybody today. But I also agree with you that, is it self-talk or is it environment? Because I've also reflected, and we can get into this, and I'm sure that you have as well, about own experiences of when it's happening. Was it the environment, or was it me, or is it a combination? So I think that's a question to hold. And then just to sort of like signpost as well, the other thing in the research I did was that there is a book by Dr. Valerie Young from 2011, so just as this swathe of research was happening, called The Secret Thoughts of Successful Women: Why Capable People Suffer from Imposter Syndrome and How to Thrive in Spite of It. And she's come up with 5 different types of ways that this thing manifests itself, which I think would also be cool to get into as well, because I've sort of thought, oh, that was interesting, and then mapped the different types of imposter syndrome, if we believe that it is a thing, that have happened to me, but equally trying to take a look as to whether or not that was environment as well. So I think there's lots to go at in this, but I think that the research and some of the things that they're finding, I found it pretty interesting.
Yeah, as I said at the beginning, I think there just needs to be care that we're talking about the same thing. And that actually, for me, my strong belief is that all sort of issues of self-confidence are just all bandied into one thing called imposter syndrome, which then prevents this analysis of actually the role of the workplace in some elements of how women feel. And I would struggle to be persuaded that this isn't something that is generally suggested to be a thing that more women suffer from than men. And Amy Cuddy had obviously said the same thing. So there's an article in HBR called Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome. And it talks about the fact that you are rarely able to go to a workshop or a big conference on women's advancement in the workplace without there being something on imposter syndrome. Whereas you wouldn't see that generally in a discussion about men or about just general leadership and progression and how to be a better leader. It's really rare. So I guess my big issue is that it's being flagged as this thing that women suffer from, that are victims of, in a way, and calling it syndrome, it becomes a bit like, you know, in the Victorian times where all the issues that women did or when they stepped out of the cultural norms was called hysteria. If you read The Authority Gap, which is also an amazing book by Marianne Sieghart, who talks about why society still struggles to take women seriously and why so many women in senior roles are still denigrated or not given the same value in society as men. And we only have to look at, she comes from it from a political affairs correspondent viewpoint, where she's talked to many female political leaders, but also then looked at why we generally on TV, there's the old wise man and then, you know, sort of the younger woman who is there to sort of provide the candy to the wise man. So I completely agree that both men and women can suffer in certain circumstances temporary feelings of not being good enough or not being, you know, oh gosh, am I, you know, loss of self-confidence. But there's a guy called Tim Wilson who did some studies on students dropping out of university because they felt that they couldn't cope. When they got to university, they suddenly thought, oh my God, I'm not as great as all these other people. And he talked about editing narratives and how feelings aren't facts and that you need to test narratives, get evidence to show, yeah, maybe you are not qualified, maybe you aren't in the right place. But actually, for the majority of people, it's just in a particular situation or a particular person will trigger that feeling of not good enoughness, if that's a word. And I completely get that if that's what we're calling them, then yes, I agree. But in terms of how it impacts on women, I do think that there is a huge, huge issue that we forget about, which is the role of the workplace. And I don't think we can deny that exists.
I completely agree with you. So I think it is a capped rule. I was just going to say that, and it'll lead me into what I was about to, that the Tim Wilson piece, I read somewhere about that whole element about where you've potentially been like top of the class, et cetera, whilst you're at school. And then you go to university and you're with a multitude of people who have also been top of the class at the school that they've come from. And suddenly that's the shift in narrative. And, you know, I am a coach who looks at both self and environment. They're intrinsically linked. So whether we're calling this thing imposter syndrome or not, there are things that go on that are within the environment and within the self, and it becomes chicken and egg. Which came first? If you are having these feelings, if we look back on history, it has become something to be linked just to women. Is, as I said, there has been no research or minimal research until much more recently about gender differences, because it was always starting with, Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes about women. But the book that I found about Valerie Young, so she talks about 5 different types. And this, I think, starts to break it down rather than this catch-all of imposter syndrome. And she talks about 5 different elements. So there are, and I tracked this to my own history, which I won't go into, but I could see almost all of them in me, and then how they get exacerbated by environment or not, as the case may be. So first one is perfectionist. So when you're focusing on quality, demanding perfection, fear of failure, these people tend to avoid new things because they want to remain great at what they're actually doing. There's the superhero who has many, many roles to juggle, wants to be successful of everything. They feel that they should be able to do even more. And actually, it's shame feelings that come up when they can't do it all. And I could go for hours talking about that, taking on motherhood and working full time and feeling like I was failing at everything. Interesting one, natural genius. When something is hard, they perceive failure, but they've got to work hard at trying to do something new. The expert, who knows everything, and when they don't, they perceive failure. And finally, the soloist. I can do it myself. I don't need any help. And so I thought that was really interesting, because when you break it down, if that's what we're talking about, then I could relate to all of those. I don't tend to call myself an imposter. I have known with more senior roles to have jokingly said, but actually meaning it, I wake up every morning wondering if today is when I get found out. And I will take responsibility for a lot of that being me. And equally, when I've looked back over my history, there is some of the time when I haven't had the support that I've needed. I haven't asked for it because I haven't asked for help, but that's when you want to have leaders and managers around who can spot what's going on in somebody and say, come and have that conversation, come and have a chat. So I know when I am coaching people, all of those things that I have described, I have found in the people that I've been coaching, but I don't ever make it just their responsibility. I'm asking them about what their relationships look like, both inside and outside of work. What is the environment like? And then what they can generate or leave, as we've talked about before, what goes on. But they are intrinsically linked, is my belief.
Yeah, I've come across those examples of what is called imposter syndrome. I would challenge that's just to do with self-confidence. And for example, neither of us have the experience of some of the other elements of oppression that women of colour, for example, or women who are not cis may experience. And so that for me is where the elements of the system come in much, much more. And, no matter how much of the feelings aren't facts, redirecting the narrative, etc., when you are facing this every day, and we're going to talk about this in another episode, microaggressions or even macroaggressions, but if you're constantly fed this undercurrent of the narrative, that even if it isn't explicitly said, this where you are the only woman in the room, where you're constantly talked over, where people show that they don't value your input, you will start to automatically question whether or not you actually should be in this place. It's a kind of gaslighting that you start to go, oh God, actually, maybe I'm not as clever as I thought. Maybe the things that I have to contribute are not as important as I thought. Maybe my ideas aren't very good. And it's difficult to challenge those sort of things. And so I don't know that in terms of how we can advise people to deal with this, what we're calling imposter syndrome. Dealing with the systems is more difficult. But if we're going to talk about the way that we can challenge some of these false beliefs that we have, because I guess the reality is that everyone feels a little bit out of their depth at times. But if we are constantly feeling that, if we really can't see the reality of the contributions we make, then obviously those are things that we need to start to think about and to work through with coaching. And also, I think, the issue of what support you need when we're not talking about a systemic misogyny or a systemic racialized context, then absolutely leaders play a huge, huge part in helping people to realize their value and to build on their confidence in the situations where they don't feel confident.
Yeah, I wouldn't have any answers as to how we deal with it from a systemic perspective. But I do think from a leadership perspective, it's one leader at a time. I suppose what I'm struggling with is that every time I say something, I'm thinking, oh God, am I being too generalistic now? If that's a word. But again, the research that I have read, if you are to use the capture all, is that you can't cure it. Research says that you can't cure it. You can improve it through self and circumstances so that it doesn't eat you alive. Because I think the other thing with this business of it being a catch-all is people are using it when in fact they actually need help for anxiety and depression and burnout because of what they themselves have had to happen to them, be that, their own self-talk or the talk that they, as you are rightly pointing out, could have been experiencing day in, day out.
Yeah, and I think we can agree on that, absolutely. But I'm interested to hear you say that the research suggests that imposter syndrome, if we're going to talk about it in terms of it being this sort of feeling of I am not good enough for this role or for whatever it is, that it can't be cured. That makes me quite sad, because the work of Tim Wilson, and he's got a book called Redirect, he found that actually a lot of this required just changing the narrative or your own narrative. And I wonder why then it's impossible to cure. Because, so for example, you talked about university, and I suffered from this massively at university. Went to university having been, one of the top of my class. Suddenly at Oxford University, everyone's fucking brainiac. And I just fell to pieces and ended up getting a not particularly great degree because I really struggled to feel worthy, and I don't think there was the support, as you said, the support at that time wasn't there. I don't think anyone really noticed. I was just another kid who maybe wasn't reaching their potential. But a lot of that was self-talk. And I strongly suspect that if I'd maybe had a chat with Tim Wilson at some point, and not that I dropped out, but I didn't do what I was supposed to do at uni, that this was a narrative issue about I just was shocked by having gone from being a big fish in a small pond to being a fairly small fish in a big pond. And I don't know that should have been. So
when I say cure, I mean it never coming back again. So absolutely having a chat with Tim Wilson or somebody like him to put you back together in a different way, and the strategies around your self-talk and where you felt you were positioned in the brainiac mode, because you are a brainiac. It's just that decided that you weren't on that occasion, but just telling you is not going to make it work. But so you can be cured in that circumstance. What I'm suggesting is not then gone forever. It can come back, and here we're back to the circumstances.
Oh yeah, okay.
So if I think about myself, and all of those different types that I was saying that Valerie Young came up with, I found them all quite relatable, thinking, oh, bloody hell, is there any one of them that I haven't encountered in my multiple decades? And when I say not being cured, I know I am going through it right now. Well, not maybe right now, but in the circumstances that I'm in. And, well, which one am I in right now?
Website design,
website
Bobby.
design. And so dearest Bridget is trying to get me to use ChatGPT. Of course, what I'm tussling with is that I don't know how to use ChatGPT. So rather than trying it, it's too hard. So I'm still struggling with having, a complete meltdown on being able to write content for the website. So I am definitely in the, I wouldn't say natural genius or expert, but maybe that is, because things that I do that I find easy, if something is hard, I don't want to do it. And that is a definite trend that has got better as I've had people around me to say, come on, give it a go, stretch yourself. And of course, the irony is that I do that to everybody else all of the time. So I'm in that.
I do it too, Bobby. Don't worry.
At the moment. So when I saw that there was no cure, I was like, "Damn right there isn't," because I'm being partially eaten alive at the moment that I need to step out of. But I have got the strategies to be able to do it. But that's not to say that you have the days where you have to wait until you're about to start a podcast recording and get a bollocking from your partner in crime about, I've told you what it is that you should be doing. But I think that's what I'm meaning by no cure. There will always be something new, a new situation where those things that you have had grab you before can do it again.
Yeah. What are the strategies? So I'm interested in that, Bobby. You talked about you've got some strategies that you use to help you get through these sort of pockets of, I think maybe that's how I like to look at it, rather than that women suffer or men suffer, or everybody suffers from imposter syndrome. There are times and situations where you may feel that sort of, I don't know what I'm doing, I shouldn't be here.
So I'm going to try and
do you use?
Do this, as I tell you, both from a self, this could be too complicated and I really shouldn't have tried it, but I'm going to try, both from my own perspective, but also what I believe leaders should be up to. Right? So the first one I'd say is that the first thing that happens, I think, is what goes on in your head. So your self-chat. So if we take the ChatGPT example, I am going, that is too difficult. I don't even know where to go and look on the computer. I won't be able to do it. So my self-chat is incredibly negative, rather than trying to get my self-chat to be looking at facts. So as I said to you out loud, and we'll come on to the out loud bit, well, I'd never used MS Designer before, but I like drawing pretty pictures and I worked out how to do that. So why would ChatGPT? So you start getting into your self-chat about facts as to why you are capable of doing particular things. So you change your internal dialogue. So what I'd say of leaders is to, and actually let me do point number 2, because then it would make more sense. Because the other thing is sharing feelings. So we're back to finding safe space. So you asked me how I was this morning, and I told you I got my kindly bollocking, and I have now some idea to actually go and give it a go. So one, it reduces loneliness, that you think that you're not on your own with all of this, and others can then open up to how they see you. So you were almost like, well, it makes no sense for you being like this, because you could just go and do it. You've got plenty of stuff. And of course, when we started talking about it, I was saying, oh, well, I've got this that I've written already that I could push through it. So you gave me space to do that. So from a leader, spotting somebody who has a habit, but not even spotting somebody that has it going on, but creating those type of conversational spaces where you can be saying, I'm choosing you to do X because I think you can do ABC. So you're almost changing the internal dialogue for them. And then be asking the questions around, how does that sound? How are you feeling? Are you ready to give this a go? so that the person can turn around and go, no, I'm shitting myself. What is it that you think I can do that I can't see for myself, so you can support somebody in it?
Bobby, I love that, because I think the issue for the leader to say, I'm asking you to do this because you've already done all of the things that are required to be able to do this, or I'm asking you to do this because I've been impressed by how you dealt with this situation. It's such a powerful thing to say to someone, rather than, right, off you go and organize this conference. As you said, the narrative is so important, to be able to cut off some of the initial, because it's really hard for an internal voice to go, oh God, how am I going to do that? When your boss has already said, but you've already done these 3 things, which are effectively what I'm asking you to do. So you're effectively cutting off some of that negative self-talk before it can even start.
And I think which is the really other element with the sharing of feelings is the checking back. So not necessarily formal one-to-ones and all that cobblers, but, picking the phone up to them, or if you are in an office, bumping into them to say, how's it going? And doing that as a habit, so they can go, oh, I'm struggling a bit with this. All right, well, let's sit down and talk about that bit, so that they know that they can say it. So I think those are 2 very important. This next one, celebrating success. We are really not very good at speaking. I'm talking about generally, but you and I in particular are not very good about speaking positively about ourselves a lot of the time. Or somebody will say that we've done something really great and we flick it off. And we've talked about that before. So the practice for self about speaking positively. And if you struggle doing that, I often go back and look at my LinkedIn recommendations if I'm having a bad day, because there's a lot of people out there that actually don't think I've done half a bad job. And so you need those reminders some of the time. And then from a leader perspective, speaking positively about people, or making sure that achievements are properly celebrated, I think is really important, because you're bolstering and keeping the voices at bay by helping people do that.
Yeah, I think that's really a really important point. And you say that we're not very good about celebrating our own successes. And I have just had a piece in our local paper about me. And it was one of the most uncomfortable things, writing a whole load of stuff about me, sending it off, and then thinking, oh God, that just sounds all a bit like showing offy. I don't know if that's a verb or an adjective. And then kind of forgetting about it. And it took a while, and thinking, oh, you see, they obviously thought it was shit. They obviously thought I'm an idiot, or I'm just like really full of myself. And then when it came out, and just the wonderful overflow of loveliness that came back. And I completely agree that you have to keep those, not as memories, but actually to save them. Absolutely. So you have got something you can go back and look at and remind yourself. That's the evidence. It's the testing your narrative, whatever's going on in your head. Those feelings are not facts. Get evidence from other people, because there's nothing better than seeing yourself through the eyes of someone else. Actually, sometimes it's really shocking to see yourself through the eyes of other people, and suddenly realizing, actually, you know what? Yeah. They seem to think that I'm really good at X, Y, and Z. I wonder why that is. Could it be that actually I am good at X, Y, and Z? Woo! Light bulb explodes over top of head. So I do think it's really important that people do it voluntarily to tell other people about, celebrate successes, but also that we keep notes. I always used to tell my team that they should be keeping a diary of their achievements, one for their CVs to update, for interviews, for when they went off and got much better jobs, and for their end of term year reviews, because we only ever did them once a year. But yeah, that actually keeping a little diary of your wins, so that if you are feeling a little bit glum or feeling a little bit inadequate, you can go back and go, actually, here's my evidence. But I love the idea of the LinkedIn recommendations. I think that's a really good idea. There's
a few more. Let go of perfectionism. So if we go back to the perfectionist piece, and I'm a past master at having ridiculously exacting standards for myself, about when I need to get things done by, what they need to look like, which allows a level of dissatisfaction to creep in for self. But when you're doing it, my experience is that a level of dissatisfaction in everybody else creeps in as well. So as a leader, I think we have to be really careful of that we are, potentially sometimes expecting too much. So this is a bit of a dangerous one, and you have to be careful with it. But I am suggesting adjusting our standards and being able to articulate to our team what 70% looks like, and then helping them learn when 70% will do.
Yeah, I really like that.
Also, again, with this, is checking on progress. So I talk to lots of organisations now where they will set these, huge objectives for the year. And I ask them, well, how often do they make it back onto the table for you to see how they're going in exactly that form? And often there'll be a whole host of other conversations and people lose sight of what it was that they'd actually first set out to achieve and haven't taken the time to be going, well, by month 6, it needs to look like this. And by month 8, it needs to look like this. And so you can adjust standards as you go, as long as it's just the fact that, I haven't looked at it because it was too difficult. But even if it is that, I put it in the too difficult to deal with pile, says me, talking about myself, and now I'm way behind. As a leader, it's adjusting the standards or chunking it up so people feel that they can achieve it. So I think in the letting go of perfectionism, and, I've had people work for me who's like, oh, well, I'm not going to publish X until it's all finished. Well, you'll never publish it then.
Yeah. That first step is often the thing that holds people back. And I recognize, I see you're striving for perfection, Bobby, in a lot of things that you do. It's a superpower, but it also can be your kryptonite really sometimes, I think.
Sure.
If a leader can recognize that in certain team members or in themselves, that the first step, that perfectionist element of it is what's holding things back, is to have a accountability buddy or to have someone to support through that first step. I'm a huge procrastinator for many reasons, and I think I could tick off a whole load of those examples of what we're calling imposter syndrome. There are elements that hold me back or just stop me facing up to getting on with things. And one of the things that, the chunking it, I think, is really important, or recognizing that sometimes you do need to chunk things down, eating the elephant piece by piece. And then maybe allocating, if it becomes obvious that it's just is something that's an enormous task, that being able to allocate a chunk of elephant to someone else, or to have someone help you eat the first chunk of elephant, are all things that as a leader you should be really aware of.
So there's a couple more. Self-compassion, another one that you and I are both so incredibly good at. And this is about being able to do it for yourself. And I think this goes back to what we were saying about the beginning, around the environment. If you can get a hold of being able to be kind to self in an internal sort of way, rather than looking for reassurance externally constantly, you build greater resilience as well as self-compassion. Although the self-compassion builds resilience. I'm not trying to decry all the things that you were talking about what happens systemically, but I can only speak from my own experience, and knowing that I spent a lot of my 20s and 30s wanting reassurance from other people that I'd done a good job or whatever, rather than being able to be kindly to myself rather than constantly beating myself up. And I still, deal with that, but I am much better at soothing myself than I ever was. And I think that that's a really important thing that I think it's Wendy Palmer who makes the suggestion that we should do things not for applause, but do them anyway. And I think that goes a lot way to the cultivating self-compassion. So that's another strategy.
I think that also, once you do, as men and women, develop self-compassion, it also enables you to be compassionate to other people, because I think it's difficult to have empathy with yourself and to have self-compassion if you are not also able to externalize that to other people. So although weirdly, I wonder whether actually it's more like it's easier to be compassionate and empathetic to other people than it is to be to yourself. I think that some people can be compassionate and can empathize with what other people are going through, but still struggle to do it for themselves. So maybe it isn't, one causes the other, but actually it is something that often you really do have to work at, because it's seen as selfish or it's seen as self-indulgent. Sometimes I think maybe that's my feeling, is sometimes when I'm trying to self-soothe or developing strategies to self-soothe, I do sit there and go, oh God, it's such a big baby. What the hell are you doing? So I do think that, it's really difficult. I think we should talk about that more.
It could be a whole topic of its own, because, we go back to talking about people shaping, males or females. I come from a family where big girls don't cry. Well, big girls do cry, and quite a lot, and I find it very cathartic. But when you've had a whole lifetime of being told that that's not what you should be doing, I think I might have said this on another episode, would have blamed that being my dad's voice. It's not my dad's voice, it's my own. I'm the one that's giving myself a hard time the whole time now, not anybody else. So I do. It's a massive topic, all of its very own.
But it impacts on men hugely, because this is another example of where society generally tells men, like, big girls don't cry, but men absolutely are told they don't cry. And that impacts on their ability to show vulnerability. It impacts on ability to self-soothe, to be compassionate with themselves, and is then reflected in, I'm not saying this is the only reason, but is reflected in huge numbers of male suicides, because they have not been given the tools to be able to ask for help or help themselves. Feelings, deal with all of those feelings that we all have, whether we're male or female. It's just we are conditioned to deal with them differently. So what is the next one?
Share your failures. Oof. So from a leader perspective, I would say the things to start practicing are saying, I don't know, and I need help. And again, when we go back to that, being in a team that shares failures as well, or shares when things have gone awry or aren't going well, you share the learning. You realise you're not alone. It's not just you, and it creates safer space. So, again, celebrating successes. I've recently done a podcast with the Institute of Leadership, and I was very willing to talk about when things haven't gone right, because that's where I've learned most.
And it was a really good,
and I enjoyed doing it. And you and I are pretty good at talking about where we've cocked things up. I think that, and I hope that does help other people, because it doesn't always go right. In my youth, I would go and crawl away and think that the end of the world had come. In fact, it's much better to just fess up and get on with it and see what happens next, and be better next time. So I think for leaders as well, being able to do that, to show that it's fine for people to give things a go and to take a risk, and that you're going to hold them if it doesn't go quite right, as long as they learn from it. I think that's very important in trying to combat this imposter syndrome.
So, final one.
Accept it. We're back all the way to the beginning of there not necessarily being a fully blown cure for it to never happen again. But you can quieten it a great deal by these strategies. And then there is a level of acceptance that when changes happen in life, changes happen in roles, that the feelings might come back, and you then have the strategies to help you if it's getting out of control.
Awesome. Well, it's fairly comprehensive, and I hope that it helps people when they listen to this to be able to find ways to calm that feeling or that voice. And we are at the end of this session. So
the quotes, here's the first one. Acknowledge your fear, understand it, and then get comfortable existing in a space with it. It's one by Ali Datilio. And then the other one, it's anonymous, but I love it, is, are you even good enough to have imposter syndrome? It's just amused me.
Wow.
Indeed.
Crikey, tough love.
Thank you.
Well,
Speak soon.
thanks, Bobby.
Bye. Thanks for listening. Links to any references we have made are provided on our website and on the Spotify podcast page. Next week, Bridge and I will be tackling silo working, our experiences of working in organisations where silos are an issue, considering where a silo mentality might work, and what else do organisations need. So join us for being a wall breaker. Yes, I said wall.